Good morning again. It's great to be with you here today. In our readings here today, we find that both Elijah and Jesus' disciples, they're in this difficult and, in a sense, dire situations. And all because they're simply doing the will of God. Elijah was sent by God to defeat the prophets of Baal who were leading the Israelites astray. And now, though, he's fleeing for his life because Queen Jezebel is upset that he has destroyed her prophets. And so he is on the run, and he's now hiding in a cave in Mount Horeb. He's afraid. Likewise, the disciples were simply doing what Jesus asked them to do. He said, "Hey, get in the boat and precede me to the other side while I dismiss the crowds." But now they've been rowing for a few miles, and they're caught in the midst of this life-threatening storm. So the waters are splashing up against their boat, the wind is howling, and their little boat is being tossed around on the sea, kind of like a toy. And like Elijah, they're afraid. In some ways, these stories can sound really dramatic, maybe distant from our lives. But I think in other ways, they can also sound very familiar to us. And they were readings, too, that brought great consolation to the early church, who Matthew was writing to, a church that was often being persecuted for striving to follow the Lord and his ways, striving to be Christians. But for many of us, our boat, if you will, is maybe our home, our job, our family, relationships, our health. And much like Jesus' disciples, we sometimes feel we're being tossed about by the waves of worry, by the winds of problems we didn't ask for. Perhaps debts are piling up. Maybe a son or daughter is kind of going astray, don't know how to bring them back. Maybe a loved one is struggling with a terminal illness, or we just feel like our future is so uncertain. Sometimes even our faith maybe feels like it's hard to hold on to. Seems like it's slipping away. And so we cry out for help from God. Maybe like Peter, "Lord, save me, help me." But help doesn't always come in the same manner or in the time frame sometimes that we're looking for it. And if that's true for you in your life, maybe we can take a little bit of solace that we're not much different than maybe the prophet Elijah and the disciples here today. You see, for Elijah, he expected that God would appear to him in that wind and in that earthquake and in that fire. Why would he expect that? It's because when you go back to Exodus, that's how the Lord spoke to the people, the Israelites, as they were fleeing Egypt and were out in the desert. He came to them in wind and earthquakes and fire and revealed himself to us. And so too with us. But instead, with Elijah, what does God do? He reveals himself to him in a new way, in a quiet, whispering sound. Something for us to reflect on. How does the Lord reveal himself to us? Sometimes we're looking for big, dramatic ways. Maybe sometimes it's in the small ways, in a small whispering sound that we need to be attentive to and listen to. And so too with us then, God doesn't always reveal himself in the ways we expect. And for the disciples, in a previous storm out on the same lake, earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was in the boat with them. He was just sleeping. So they woke him up and asked him to calm the waves. But this time, it's dark. It's in the fourth watch of the night. somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning. They've been rowing for a while. And this time, Jesus is not in the boat. And so like them, we sometimes might wonder, Lord, where are you? Don't you care? Why does it seem that you're not doing anything to help us? But I think it's then maybe the Lord wants us to ask us, if I immediately removed every problem from your life, exactly when you asked me, when would you ever learn to trust me? How would your faith grow? And so today I think we're called to I have just a few little brief thoughts on this gospel for us as we maybe face some of life's storms. And the first is I think Jesus sees us even in the midst of our storms. The gospel says that Jesus went up on a mountain to pray, but he never lost sight of that boat out there on the lake. He saw the disciples struggling, and even when they couldn't see him. And he came when he was ready. Friends, even we sometimes feel alone, maybe abandoned, helpless, but God never loses sight of us. He knows our pain. He knows the tears we cry, maybe in silence. He knows the struggles in our mind and in our hearts. Just because we can't see him or feel him, perhaps, it doesn't mean he's absent. Maybe like a parent teaching their child how to take their first steps, God sometimes allows us to struggle. It's not that he doesn't care, but because he wants us to grow in faith and trust and courage in him. Second, we should never be afraid to cry out to the Lord in our need. When Peter sees Jesus walking out on the water, he cries out, Lord, hey, if that's you, command me to come to you on the water. And Jesus says, come. I think sometimes if I were in the boat, I would have been saying to Peter, are you crazy? What are you doing? You can't get out of the boat. You'll sink. But Peter gets out of that boat and he begins to walk on the water. The great courage of Peter. And as long as he kept his eyes fixed on Jesus, he stays afloat. But as soon as he begins to focus there on the winds and the waves, what happens? He begins to sink. And I think so often, sometimes, the same thing happens to us. When we focus in on our problems, when we lose sight, of the Lord, and when they seem to get bigger and we get smaller, we tend to sink. We lose focus. We get overwhelmed. We maybe fall into sin. We make bad decisions. But the good thing is, Jesus doesn't scold us and say, see, I told you so. Instead, he immediately reaches out to help us, like he did to Peter, who said, Lord, save me. And so today we're called to cry out, to pray. Even if our prayers are maybe just tears at times, even if the Lord, even if it's just, Lord, save me. I think those are maybe 3 of the greatest words we've ever heard in the Gospels and prayed. And finally, one last lesson from this gospel is this, I think. It's interesting to me that Jesus first calmed the disciples before he calmed the storm. He said, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Only after saying that and then getting into the boat does the storm and the waves and the wind die down. I think often God wants to calm our hearts before he changes the circumstances in our lives. Sometimes the storms outside continue for a while, But when we trust in Jesus and we feel his peace within, we often discover that we have the strength to keep going on. There's a story about a father who was teaching his son how to ride a bicycle. The boy was frightened and said, Dad, don't let go. Hold on. The father smiled and said, hey, son, I'm right here. You don't have to worry. And the son still wobbled a little bit, but he kept pedaling. Before he knew it, he was riding his bicycle all on his own. And I think that's what Jesus says to us today. Hey, I'm right here. Do not be afraid. So my friends, I think sometimes we recognize storms are a part of our life. We can't always avoid them. But they do not have to have the last word. Jesus does. And so we encounter storms in our life. It might be a cancer, might be depression, losing a job, losing the life of a loved one. Let us listen again to the voice of Jesus who says, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Let us also remember the words from the psalm that we heard today, that his salvation is near to those who hope in him. And the words of St. Paul to the Romans, that we are heirs to the promises that were made to his children, Israel. So let us also trust here today that God whispers to us in the trials of our lives, as he did to Elijah, that he who has called us to walk along the way of his steps, like the disciples, will save us whenever we begin to sink. He will calm the winds and the waves and stay in our boat. So let us not give up. Let us not lose heart. Storms may come, but the Lord of the storm walks with us. May God give you peace.